So what we're going to be looking at today is the gross domestic product, which is, again, just a measure of how we see the size of the economy, how we measure the size of the economy. So the GDP is just simply the total value of all final goods and services produced in a nation by the land, labor, and capital of that country over a period of time. So essentially the total value of all final goods and services produced within the borders of a country by that country's land, labor, and capital. So the key thing to understand is that word final goods. So intermediate goods are not measured, which means that, for example, a car, when you buy a new car from the lot, that counts as GDP. But when the company that made the engine sells that to the company that assembles the car, that is not. That's an intermediate good. Okay, so all the parts of the car, when they get made and sold, are intermediate goods. They don't count as GDP until the final product is sold to the final customer. So that way things don't get counted twice. So it's the total value of all final goods and services produced in a nation over a period of time. Usually that period is a year. The GDP, look at that last word there, product. It's a measure of how much a nation produces. So it also does not count secondhand sales. So for example, what you buy at Goodwill, or if you buy a used car, or if you buy a pre-existing house, those do not count toward the GDP because those were already produced. They counted toward GDP in the year they were produced and originally sold, but not now. Obviously, black market transactions don't count either because they're not recorded, and barter or off the books transactions as well don't count because, again, they're not recorded. And so in the US, GDP tends to be fairly accurate, although there are a number of barter and off the books transactions that obviously don't get recorded, and obviously a number of black market or illegal transactions that don't as well. But because of that, and that's one of the weaknesses of GDP we'll get to in a bit, especially in countries that have a significant amount of non-market economic activity, where there's a lot of barter that takes place, for example, in countries that have more of a traditional economy or traditional society, GDP is going to be very underreported in those countries because a lot of the economic activity is not measured in gross domestic product because it's not measured with an exchange of money for a good or service. And so to understand this, we got to understand that there is what we call a circular flow. And that is there's two types of markets. Okay, and what we've learned is in a market economy, markets where people come to exchange goods and services. So there's a factor market, and then there's the product market. In the factor market, firms, businesses buy land, labor, and capital. And then they turn that land, labor, and capital into goods and services, and they sell those goods and services. So they buy land, labor, and capital from households and then sell the goods and services they produce to households. So in the factor market, the firm is the buyer and the household is the seller. And then in the consumer market or the product market, it's the opposite. We as households buy goods and services, and we sell and firms sell those goods and services. You know, we buy, they sell, and we depend on each other. I depend on the salary I make in the factor market that I get from selling my labor 8 hours a day to be able to have the money to buy the goods and services I need, like, you know, food and shelter and things I want, like entertainment. Meanwhile, in the factor market, they depend on us being able to sell our labor as well as our land and capital so that they can produce those goods and services and make a profit. Remember that every transaction, both sides profit. That in the factor market, essentially, we are profiting from selling our labor and receiving money in return, and the business is benefiting from buying our labor and turning that into goods and services that they can then sell for a monetary profit or an economic profit. Whereas in the product market, obviously then they're trying to sell goods for a monetary profit, whereas we are trying to buy things that are of greater usefulness to us than the amount of money that we are spending on them. So the thing is more valuable to us in utility than the money that we're spending for it. So essentially then goods and services are bought in the product market and sold in the factor market, and they're produced in the factor market. Whereas in the product market, we are the consumers of goods and services, but we are the sellers of, but in the factor market, we are the sellers of our land, labor, and capital, and most notably our labor. So how do you remember what's different between the factor and consumer markets? Well, just remember, put a Y on the end of factor, and what do you have? You have factory, right? It's where goods and services are land, labor, and capital are combined to produce goods and services. So, and we generally have two players in these markets, businesses and households. And again, they have different roles in each market, but they're interdependent. If people don't have jobs in the factor market, they don't have money then to buy the goods and services in the product market. On the flip side, if there's no labor, if people are not willing to work, for example, or not able to work, then firms can't produce goods and services for us to buy. So we need to work to be able to have the things we want. And on the flip side, businesses need employees to be able to produce the things that they can sell for profit. And so the two things go hand in hand. Okay, we need each other. The economy is interdependent. So gross domestic product then kind of measures the final transactions in both of those markets, right? So first things first, we have what we call the expenditure approach to GDP. And it's a very simple formula. C plus I plus G plus X, or X minus M, okay? That's all you need to know. C, I, G, X, okay? Consumption is C. That is household spending. That is all total spending by households on goods and services. Now, of that, the largest is services. And that is because most of the American economy today is services. And so we don't spend quite as much on goods as we do on services. You're not as likely today to spend as much money on a TV as you are on going to the doctor or going to a restaurant to have somebody cook the food for you and serve it for you, and going out to the movies where you're paying somebody to show you a movie. Getting an education, obviously. That's the majority of our expenditures these days. About 68% of GDP, just a shade under 70%, is consumption. So roughly 2/3 of the economy is household spending. Investment is business spending. And there's two parts of that. One of them is all newly produced capital goods, such as buildings, machinery, equipment, computers, that are to be used in business to produce other things. That also could be a net change in spending for unsold finished goods, or what we call inventory change. The third part is government spending, okay? And that's the value of all goods and services purchased by all levels of government. Investment and government spending are both about 1/6 of the GDP. So about $1 out of every $6 sold in the US is investment and government spending. And then the last part is net exports, which is exports minus imports. So, and why do we add in exports and subtract imports? Well, exports are things that are produced here and sold outside the country. And so obviously we are making something and we sell it. And when you sell something, what do you get in return? Money, right? So these are things that are produced with American labor and sold in exchange for money. So those dollars come back into the country, or they get converted to dollars usually, but that money comes back into the country and benefits American companies and American workers, because they have jobs, and the companies make profit. Imports subtracts from that because while we benefit from the usefulness and utility of goods and services, those are goods and services that were produced outside of the country, and thus money has flowed from the United States out of the country. And now that money will come back either in buying our own goods and services or buying investments. Every dollar that comes out of the country eventually returns to it. But we subtract that from GDP because because while we have benefited from the usefulness and utility of those foreign goods, the money goes out of the country and also is produced with foreign labor. So our exports in 2017 were 12.1% of GDP. Our imports were minus 15%. So our net exports were about minus 2.9%. So that's kind of why if you add all of this together, you'll notice that it adds up to more than 100. And that's because net exports are a negative number. That's not necessarily a bad thing. We will look at international trade and we'll focus on this the last week or so of class. The one thing I will say is over the next 4 weeks, we'll essentially be looking at each one of these kind of broken down. So we'll be looking at consumption, spending, investment, government spending, and then in the last week we'll look at net exports and what they mean, why they're important, how do we stimulate those, what are some policies that we can use to stimulate those things, and so forth and so on. So things GDP does not measure. Any non-market transactions such as barter. It does not measure income distribution. So there's something called the Gini coefficient that does that. It does not measure quality. It just measures the final value of it, the final dollar value of it. It doesn't necessarily measure quality, either of products produced or the quality of life. Although generally countries with higher GDPs have a higher quality of life, especially higher per capita GDPs. It doesn't measure underground or illegal transactions as well. There are some other measurements of GDP. We're not going to get into those. The national income is GDP minus depreciation, which depreciation is consumption of fixed capital. Fixed capital will lose a little bit of its value over time. For example, a building will lose a little bit of its value over time. And so if we assume that the building, like a new building, has a lifespan of 50 years, we will subtract 1/50th of its value each year. That's a simple way of looking at it. Depreciation is a little more complex than that. The personal income, you can kind of see there, national income minus profits, minus Social Security, plus all transfer payments. And we are not going to look at those. Those are in the book. Just to let you know, there are other measurements of the national economy, but essentially national income is how much the United States makes in a year. Personal income is how much individuals make in a year. Those may be a little bit more relevant to each individual, but those are much less used, so we're not going to focus on those. Okay. Now, here's the issue. Okay. This is kind of what you need to know, right? Consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. This is really important. But real GDP and nominal GDP, there's kind of 3 measurements, really 4, that we'll look at. Nominal GDP is just this, okay? In raw dollars, what was our consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports for a given year? Okay? Now, here's the problem. Can we accurately compare, say, what happened in 2020 with what happened in 1960 using raw dollars? And the answer is no, right? We can't do that because there's no way of comparing what the dollar was worth then versus what the dollar is worth now. The dollar was worth a lot more in 1960 than it is now. Prices were much lower. And so comparing those two would not really work. And so the real GDP allows us to adjust for inflation so we can compare years. So we use something called the GDP chain price index that is used to convert to a base year, and then we can adjust things for inflation. And so And it kind of shows how to do this here. In 2013, the nominal GDP was 16.8 billion, or 16.8 trillion, which is 16,800 billion. The chain price index was 106.59. So if we want to convert this to the base year, we just take the nominal GDP divided by the chain price index, multiply it by 100 to get it, because the chain price index is essentially a percentage, and thus we get 15,761 billion, or 15.7 trillion in that base year. Now, we could, if we wanted to compare that to 1960, we would get the chain price index and the nominal GDP from 1960 and then convert that and see how that worked. Okay, so now there's one other measurement, and that is per capita GDP. And per capita GDP is just simply real GDP. Well, real per capita GDP would be real GDP divided by population. Raw per capita GDP, or nominal per capita GDP, would then be just the nominal GDP divided by the population. And so per capita GDP is important because it allows us to measure the wealth of a country rather than its how much, how large the country's economy is. Well, obviously, big countries are going to have the biggest economies, right? So per capita GDP allows us to compare big countries with small countries, and real GDP allows us to compare year over year, this year versus a previous year.